A continuación, se tratará de un asesinato, de un suicidio o de un fraude.
Yo creo que al departamento de investigación se le encendieron las alarmas.
Los detectives realizaron una investigación económica siguiendo el rastro de las pistas.
Había un seguro de $5 millones que encontramos después.
Había muchas cosas que no encajaban.
Al final, gracias a la ciencia, se encontraron las respuestas a todo.
Nunca he visto un caso con tantos giros en la investigación, con tantos cambios. La verdad es que fue raro.
El track pulling, o remolque de camiones con camionetas diésel, es un deporte de minorías en Estados Unidos. Pero tiene un público leal y cada vez es más conocido.
Por su diseño, tienen que remolcar mucho más peso que el que las camionetas pueden soportar. Así que tienes que ser muy buen mecánico para meterte en esto.
Para el contratista de la construcción, Ari Squire, preparar camionetas diésel para estas competiciones era más que un hobby. Era una obsesión. Para poder dedicarse a este pasatiempo, Ari construyó un garaje de 213 metros cuadrados en su casa a las afueras de Chicago.
Ari era un manitas con los coches. Tenía una camioneta en la que aparentemente siempre estaba trabajando.
Su hobby no parecía peligroso hasta que una mañana de 2008, la mujer de Ari llamó a emergencias.
Emergencias de la comisaría del condado de Lake.
Creo que se ha incendiado mi garaje. He oído un ruido. He abierto la puerta y hay mucho humo.
¿Sale humo del garaje?
¿Tengo que salir de casa o qué hago?
Espere fuera, en un lugar seguro, ¿de acuerdo?
Cuando el humo se disipó, los bomberos encontraron el cuerpo sin vida de Ari debajo de una camioneta.
Parecía que la camioneta se había resbalado del gato frontal y había aplastado a la víctima.
Tenía quemaduras de tercer grado en la mayor parte del cuerpo. Parecía que la camioneta se había caído del gato mientras Ari estaba debajo trabajando en el filtro de combustible. El carburante cayó del filtro a la ropa de Ari. La camioneta rompió un fluorescente y una chispa encendió la gasolina.
Quizás se tratara de una muerte accidental. No es la primera vez que alguien muere por trabajar bajo su vehículo, cuando éste resbala del gato que lo sujeta y le cae encima y la mata.
A pesar de que el cadáver estaba irreconocible, le sacaron el carnet de conducir de Ari del bolsillo trasero.
No solemos fiarnos de la información del carnet de conducir, porque la gente miente y a veces los datos que ponen son incorrectos.
El forense que examinó el cadáver quiso realizar una identificación utilizando métodos científicos. Pero fue mucho más difícil de lo que esperaban.
Por la gravedad de las quemaduras, no podíamos hacer uso de las huellas digitales ni podía realizarse un reconocimiento facial. Así que solo pudimos tomar el ADN y los dientes como referencia.
Según parecía, Ari Squire no había ido al dentista hacía muchísimo.
En el lugar del incendio, los investigadores vieron algo sospechoso en el cuadro eléctrico del garaje.
Analizando los interruptores del cuadro eléctrico, me di cuenta de que estaban todos bajados.
Si los interruptores del cuadro de distribución estaban apagados, no era posible que la luz estuviera encendida, y eso era, en teoría, lo que había iniciado el fuego.
Investigué para averiguar si los bomberos habían bajado los interruptores, pero dijeron que no, que ellos no habían tocado el cuadro eléctrico para nada.
Ari estaba trabajando en un filtro de combustible de una camioneta diésel. Pero las pruebas indicaban que, en la ropa de Ari, había un acelerador de combustión mucho más inflamable que el diésel.
Yo creo que para los detectives se encendieron las alarmas.
No quedaba claro qué tipo de gasolina podía haber sido ese tan ligero.
Cuando los investigadores analizaron la vida personal de Ari, sus amigos dijeron que los Squire eran un matrimonio sin hijos desde hacía 14 años, pero que entre la pareja no había amor.
No dormían en la misma cama. Cuando entré en la casa era obvio que aquella noche se habían usado las dos camas.
No era una pareja cercana, eso estaba muy claro.
Lo más sospechoso era que Ari tenía un seguro de vida de $5 millones. Y su mujer, Denise, era la única beneficiaria. Sin embargo, cuando la policía la interrogó, Denise dijo que no sabía nada del tema.
Entonces empezamos a investigar por qué la mujer no sabía esos detalles de la vida de Ari.
La esposa de Ari incineró el cadáver de su marido antes de que la policía pudiera impedírselo.
La incineración se realizó un sábado porque ella quería deshacerse del cuerpo. Creo que el lunes o el martes ya nos llamó para decirnos que necesitaba el cadáver para la cremación.
Cada vez era más obvio que se trataba de un homicidio que estaban intentando encubrir.
Cuando murió, Ari Squire estaba trabajando en un filtro de combustible de una camioneta diésel. Al recrear el incidente, los investigadores descubrieron que cualquiera podía haber soltado fácilmente el gato que sujetaba la camioneta y haber matado a la persona que estaba debajo.
A mucha gente le sorprendió que Ari no utilizara un equipo de seguridad mientras trabajaba debajo del vehículo.
Mientras los investigadores intentaban averiguar lo que estaba pasando, el detective Morrison estaba en su casa viendo la tele y vio un episodio de Crímenes Imperfectos siniestramente parecido a este.
Era el caso de Madison Rutherford, de Nueva Inglaterra. Estaba viendo el episodio y vi que habían usado otro cadáver. Había una camioneta en llamas. Él simulaba su muerte y luego volvía con otra identidad. Mientras veía el programa, me di cuenta de que había muchas similitudes entre los dos casos.
Las cantidades de dinero de los seguros eran casi iguales en ambos casos.
Madison Rutherford tenía dos seguros, uno de 5 millones y otro de 2 millones. Eran muy parecidos a los seguros de Ari porque él tenía uno de 5 millones y otro de 1 millón.
El fraude de Madison Rutherford se descubrió cuando los odontólogos forenses demostraron que Rutherford no era quien había fallecido en el incendio. Y eso fue exactamente lo que sucedió con Ari Squire. Cuando los investigadores hablaron con el dentista que había tratado a Ari hacía 10 años.
Tras varias llamadas, conseguimos localizar al dentista en California.
El informe médico era tan antiguo que no tenía radiografías.
Sí que guardaba un informe sobre un determinado diente y un empaste.
El dentista le había atendido debido a una gran caries en un molar inferior de la parte derecha y le puso un gran empaste plateado en el diente.
Cuando los investigadores estudiaron los dientes de la víctima, no tenía dicho empaste.
Teníamos un informe que indicaba que el señor Squire se había roto un brazo hacía tiempo y los huesos rotos no quedan perfectamente soldados. Así que hicimos radiografías del brazo, del que supuestamente se había roto, y no tenía ninguna muestra de la fractura ni de una fisura curada.
El cadáver, el cuerpo incinerado no era de Ari Squire.
Si no era Ari Squire, ¿quién era y por qué estaba allí debajo?
La policía recibió una pista. Se denunció la desaparición de una persona. Una mujer llamó a la policía indicando que su hijo de 20 años, Justin Newman, había desaparecido. El chico trabajaba en una tienda de bricolaje de la zona y no le habían visto desde el incendio.
Me dijo que había hablado con un hombre que venía a menudo a la tienda. El señor había hablado en privado con Justin y le había preguntado si quería un dinero extra. Así que Justin le dijo que sí, que le parecía bien.
Justin le dijo a su madre que el hombre se llamaba Ari Squire y que le iba a ayudar con unas obras en casa.
Había quedado con Ari Squire el 23 de febrero, el día que supuestamente Ari había muerto.
Dijo, mamá, me ha ofrecido $15 por hora y ahora mismo nos viene genial ese dinero.
El día posterior a la desaparición de Justin, su madre recibió un mensaje de su teléfono móvil.
Ponía, mamá, me voy a Missouri a trabajar, te llamo la semana que viene.
A la madre de Justin el mensaje no le encajó.
Justin no mandaba mensajes. Él no era así. Él me habría llamado. Era imposible que hubiera mandado ese mensaje. Él llamaba.
Era raro porque el chico desapareció el mismo día que tuvo lugar el asesinato en casa de Ari.
Mientras la policía intentaba localizar el origen del mensaje de texto, también se volvió a examinar el cuerpo quemado. Justin medía 1,70 y pesaba unos 64 kilos. Tenía prácticamente el mismo peso y la misma altura que Ari Squire. Los científicos compararon el ADN del cepillo de dientes de Justin con el de la víctima y cogieron una muestra de ADN de la madre de Justin.
Cuando vinieron a hacerme el frotis, le dije a la chica, el que está en la morgue es mi hijo, ¿verdad? Ella dijo que no, que solo hacían aquello porque era el procedimiento normal. Le contesté que era mentira. En cuanto entró y me hizo aquello, lo supe. Tuve ese presentimiento.
Cuando obtuvimos los resultados de las pruebas de ADN, supimos con certeza que teníamos el cadáver de Justin Newman.
La policía buscó intensamente el coche desaparecido de Justin Newman. Pensaron que si encontraban el coche de Newman, también encontrarían a Ari Squire. Solo un día después del incendio que provocó la muerte de Justin Newman, Denise Squire recibió un email de su marido, Ari.
Mi testamento y mis cartas están en el cajón que hay a la izquierda de la mesa de mi oficina. Están metidos en un sobre dirigido a ti.
Y 3 días después del incendio, recibió otro email de la cuenta de correo electrónico de Ari.
¿Cuándo van a devolverte mis cenizas? ¿Dónde has pensado tirarlas? ¿Necesitas algo? Gracias, Denise. Te quiere, Ari.
Yo creo que estaban intentando averiguar cómo íbamos con la investigación sin preguntarlo directamente, sin decir, oye, ¿sabes cómo van? ¿Se lo han creído?
Denise negó cualquier relación con la muerte de Justin Newman y dijo que no sabía dónde estaba Ari. Pero ahora, otro de los trabajadores de la tienda de bricolaje contó algo a la policía que dio un giro inesperado a la investigación.
Uno de los compañeros de trabajo de Justin fue a la policía y dijo que conocía a Ari Squire y que siempre estaba por allí. Pero lo más raro fue que comentó que a él también le había pedido que trabajara para él.
Justin no fue su primer objetivo. Ari ya lo había intentado con otro de los dependientes de la tienda de bricolaje que coincidía más con su edad y su descripción física.
Esa persona se llamaba Sandy Lively y tenía un físico muy similar al de Ari Squire.
Esa foto da miedo. Él era el cazador y yo su presa. Así es como yo lo veía. Me acosaba. Bueno, así fue como yo lo sentí.
No sabía que podía convertirse en su víctima. No tenía ni idea hasta que le enseñamos las fotos y daba miedo, daba mucho miedo.
Misteriosamente, Ari, que normalmente no tenía barba, se la había dejado durante las semanas anteriores al asesinato.
Ari empezó a parecerse incluso más a Sandy Lively. Con la barba, así parecían gemelos.
Cuando Sandy accedió a trabajar para Ari le dio un cuestionario muy detallado para finalmente darle el trabajo.
Nunca había visto un cuestionario para trabajar donde te preguntaran si tenías un tatuaje y de qué era. Y los piercings, yo tenía muchos por todo el cuerpo. No entendía que le importara si tenía piercings para ser carpintero.
Finalmente, Sandy accedió y quedó con Ari en su casa. Pero Sandy tuvo suerte y nunca llegaron a verse.
Se suponía que iba a ir a casa de Ari ese sábado por la mañana. Pero la noche de antes mi hija hizo una fiesta de pijamas porque cumplía 10 años y estuve despierto toda la noche, así que me quedé dormido.
Unas horas más tarde, ese mismo día, los abogados defensores creen que Ari se impacientó y fue a por el plan B, a por Justin Newman.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Justin pensaba que iba a hacer unas obras.
Quiero poner unas estanterías en esta pared.
Pero los abogados defensores creen que Ari utilizó cloroformo porque no había indicios de golpes ni traumatismos. Ari desnudó a Justin y le dejó en ropa interior para volver a vestirle con su ropa y sus zapatos. Puso a Justin debajo de la camioneta. Colocó el gato hidráulico y luego lo tiró, matando a Justin al instante. Para ocultar la identidad del cadáver, Ari lo roció con mucha más gasolina de la que tenía el filtro. Y después, utilizó un acelerador de combustión para avivar el fuego. Quería que pareciera que la camioneta había roto el fluorescente y que así había saltado la chispa que habría originado el fuego. Pero el incendio no se inició así, porque el cuadro eléctrico estaba apagado, así que la luz no estaba encendida. Lo más probable es que usara una cerilla. Además, la cantidad de gasolina que había en el cadáver era demasiada. Mucha más de la que hay en un filtro de combustible de una camioneta. Es obvio que Ari no sabía que el fuego no acaba con todo. Los dientes de Justin no se parecían a los de Ari. Y eso demostró que Ari no era la víctima.
Creo que tenía un plan para mí y que yo aquel día le arruiné el plan. Pienso en ello todos los días, todos. Incluso hay días en que no dejo de pensarlo. Los pensamientos van y vienen, lo de Justin va y viene, no sé. Las cosas podrían haber sido diferentes si hubiera ido yo.
No obstante, el caso todavía no se había cerrado, ya que la persona que había intentado simular su propia muerte y defraudar $5 millones a la empresa aseguradora estaba todavía en libertad. Los investigadores creen que el móvil de Ari Squire para provocar el fuego y simular su propia muerte era el dinero. Estaba a punto de cumplir 40 años y ya no podía pagar las cuotas mensuales del seguro de vida de 5 millones. Además, las cuotas estaban a punto de subir.
Las cuotas del seguro costaban $2.000 al año, pero llegó un punto en que iban a ascender a $13.000. Y él estaba sin blanca, no tenía dinero.
Los investigadores también encontraron pruebas de que la empresa de construcción de Ari Squire estaba al borde de la bancarrota.
En el momento del incidente, la burbuja inmobiliaria había explotado y empezábamos a entrar en la crisis. No había trabajo. Su proyecto de Florida, una urbanización de 33 pisos, no iba bien y estaba en bancarrota. Tenía muchas dificultades económicas.
Para simular su propia muerte, Ari Squire necesitaba a alguien que se pareciera a él en cuanto a peso, altura y aspecto físico.
Me dio su teléfono y apuntó el mío. Me llamaba e iba a la tienda todos los días. Era muy insistente.
Cuando Sandy Lively no apareció el día que había quedado con Ari, Ari se puso nervioso y pasó al plan B. Justin Newman. Una prueba de ADN identificó a Justin como la víctima del fuego provocado.
Ha sido lo peor que me ha pasado en la vida. Él era mi mejor amigo. Todavía hay días en que miro y digo, no me puedo creer que no esté aquí.
Siempre estaba contento. Nada le molestaba nunca. Era muy trabajador, pero también le gustaba divertirse. Era un buen tipo.
La policía pensó que Ari se había ido a Missouri porque allí era donde decía que se había ido en el mensaje falso que le había mandado a la madre de Justin. La policía de Missouri había estado buscando el deportivo rojo de Justin Newman. Y 9 días después del incendio, un agente de policía que conocía el caso lo encontró en el aparcamiento de un motel.
El motel no era el típico motel familiar, era un motel decadente.
El recepcionista del motel identificó a Ari Squire como el hombre que estaba alojado en la habitación.
Pero la habitación estaba registrada a nombre de Justin Newman.
El policía decidió dirigirse a la habitación sin pedir refuerzos, a pesar de que sabía que seguramente Ari iba a estar armado y preparado.
Antes de abrir la puerta, oyó un disparo. Cuando entró, vio un cadáver y una pistola.
La víctima tenía la identificación de Justin Newman, el mismo color de pelo y de ojos. Pero a pesar del intento por disfrazarse, el ADN confirmó que el cadáver pertenecía a Ari Squire.
Él sabía que se había metido en un buen lío y optó por la huida fácil porque sabía que le iban a meter en la cárcel para el resto de su vida.
Pensó en que iba a estar entre rejas el resto de su vida y se dijo, no, eso no va a pasar. A Ari Squire, su mente autodestructiva y su narcisismo no le permitieron reunir el valor necesario para volver.
Donna Fiorito interpuso una demanda civil de homicidio culposo a Denise Squire por la muerte de su hijo Justin. y el jurado le otorgó una indemnización por $6 millones.
No me puedo creer que no esté aquí. Que Ari Squire y su mujer tuvieran dinero, pero no les resultara suficiente. Tuvieron que matar a un chico joven que tenía toda la vida por delante.
La investigación por la posible participación de Denise Squire sigue abierta.
Este no es el final del caso. Todavía quedan temas pendientes que estamos investigando.
El abogado de Denise niega que ella tuviera nada que ver.
Ella no sabía nada del plan, no sabía nada del desarrollo de los hechos, ni conocía al fallecido, el señor Newman.
Sin embargo, los emails que Ari y Denise se intercambiaron tras el incendio.
Iban a dar los $5 millones. ¿A quién se los iban a dar? A Denise. Así que si pretendía sacar algo de todo esto, necesitaba que ella participase.
Ari Squire pasó meses planeando el asesinato. Pero la ciencia ayudó a los investigadores a descubrir la verdad.
Es una locura. Estaba loco.
Ese hombre no valía nada, era un cobarde que optó por el camino fácil después de haberle quitado la vida a un chico de 20 años que tenía toda la vida por delante.
En este caso, la ciencia forense funcionó. La odontología forense funcionó.
Nunca he visto un caso con tantos giros en la investigación, con tantos cambios. La verdad es que fue raro.
No se puede engañar a la ciencia. Por definición, no se puede. Es ciencia y funciona. Es consistente y verificable, y además, está aceptada.
A continuación, un incendio sospechoso está a punto de matar a toda una familia.
Si se hubiera quedado allí mucho más, no habría sobrevivido.
Un mes después, asaltan al marido y asesinan a la mujer.
¿Quién lo había hecho? ¿Quién quería hacerle daño a ella?
Todo el mundo estaba alerta. Habían comprado luces y sensores nuevos. Todos estaban un poco tensos.
La policía no encontró testigos, ni un móvil convincente, ni sospechosos.
Fue un ataque salvaje y brutal.
Hasta que la ciencia desveló un elaborado plan.
Hizo pensar a todo el mundo.
Michael y Effie Radley no se conocieron de una forma convencional, ni a través de amigos, ni en el colegio o la universidad.
Hola.
Hola.
Parece que tienes un problema, ¿no?
Sí.
Se conocieron porque a Effie se le pinchó una rueda y Michael paró para ayudarla.
¿Podrías ayudarme?
Sin problema, Michael.
Gracias, soy Effie. Me alegró mucho saber que Effie encontrara a alguien con quien salir porque anteriormente no había tenido muchos novios.
18 meses después de su casual encuentro, la pareja se casó, pero la unión solo duró 3 meses.
Al principio estuvieron casados poco tiempo. Lo dejaron, pero nunca perdieron realmente el contacto.
Sin embargo, menos de un año después, la pareja volvió a casarse y pronto tuvo descendencia. Un niño al que llamaron Aiden.
Yo sabía que si Effie tenía oportunidad de volver con Michael, volvería, porque le quería mucho, le quería de verdad.
Michael trabajaba para la aseguradora médica Blue Cross and Blue Shield. La pareja vivía en una casa móvil al lado de los padres de Michael en Briceville, Florida. Pero solo unas semanas después de volver con su nuevo hijo del hospital, llegó la tragedia. Se produjo un incendio en casa de Michael y Effie. Michael consiguió sacar al bebé intacto, pero Effie quedó atrapada dentro. En vez de esperar a que llegaran los bomberos, Michael usó una antena parabólica para romper la ventana.
¡Effie! ¡Effie! ¡Sal, vamos!
La prensa local le trató como un héroe por lo que había hecho.
La mujer de Michael dijo que estaba dormida y que no sabía qué estaba pasando porque pasó todo muy rápido.
En aquel momento ni lo pensé, pero cuando salí me di cuenta de lo que estaba pasando. Fue una alegría verle y saber que estaba bien.
Michael dice que se alegra de haberse despertado.
Intento no pensar en lo que podría haber pasado si no me hubiera despertado. Da miedo pensarlo.
Como periodista le oí decir eso y pensé, este tío es todo un héroe. Al ver cómo había quedado la casa, te dabas cuenta de que si se hubiera quedado allí mucho más, no habría sobrevivido.
Los investigadores determinaron que el foco del incendio había sido una red eléctrica mal instalada y que además el detector de humos no funcionaba.
El incendio se consideró accidental.
Michael, Effie y su hijo se fueron a vivir con los padres de Michael.
Effie tenía su propia habitación en casa de los padres, así que los padres de Effie les ayudaron a reinstalarse después del incendio.
Pero un mes después, la tragedia de nuevo volvió a cebarse con los Radley.
Michael Radley estaba durmiendo en el salón con su hijo recién nacido. Lo hacía a menudo para que Effie se quedara sola en la habitación y pudiera dormir más.
Michael oyó un ruido proveniente de la habitación.
Eso fue lo que le despertó y llamó su atención. Así que fue a la habitación para ver si ella estaba bien.
Cuando entró, encontró la ventana abierta y a su mujer sangrando en la cama.
¿Diga?
Hola.
¿Qué sucede?
Toma, papá, díselo tú. Habla tú con él.
Hola.
¿Qué está pasando, señor?
No lo sé. Mi hijo acaba de entrar. Mi nuera está en la cama y parece que se ha caído.
Vale, ¿qué está haciendo?
Está tumbada en la cama.
¿Está inconsciente?
Sí.
La ambulancia llevó a Effie al hospital más cercano a toda prisa.
Según el personal de rescate, cuando llegaron estaba viva y respiraba. Dijeron que tenía un hilo de vida.
Fue horrible. Recuerdo que salí y le dije a Joy que estaba mal, muy mal.
El médico de urgencias vino a hablar con nosotros. Nos explicó que Effie había sufrido heridas que le iban a provocar la muerte y que era imposible que sobreviviera.
Se sospechaba que alguien había entrado en casa de los Radley y que esa persona había atacado a Effie Radley. Los médicos de urgencias habían descubierto que alguien le había golpeado 7 veces en la cabeza con un objeto contundente.
Las heridas tenían claramente forma de estrella, y eso suele indicar que se ha golpeado a la persona con un objeto redondo.
Este crimen era algo personal, no solo por el alcance de las heridas, sino por el lugar en el que se habían producido. No era una herida realizada por un disparo o por una cuchillada. Era un ataque violento, muy violento.
Effie no tenía enemigos. Todos los que la conocían la querían. ¿Quién? ¿Quién lo había hecho y por qué?
Tras 4 días, los médicos decidieron que el daño neuronal era demasiado grande. Y con el permiso de la familia, desconectaron a Effie de la máquina que la mantenía viva.
Siempre había pensado, ¿qué voy a hacer si le pasa algo a alguno de mis hijos? Seguro que todo el mundo lo piensa, pero cuando pasa, la cosa cambia. Te puedes preparar para ello todo lo que quieras, pero eso no eliminará el efecto que producirá en ti.
Parecía que el asesino de Effie entró y salió por la ventana de la habitación que daba a la calle, mientras todas las demás personas que había en la casa estaban dormidas en otras habitaciones.
En la ventana encontraron la mosquitera que habían cortado. Estaba justo debajo de la ventana.
En cuanto entré en el cuarto, vi las gotas de sangre en la pared de detrás de la cama de Effie.
Los padres de Michael Radley dijeron que durante el ataque no habían oído ningún ruido proveniente de la habitación.
El asesinato de Effie Radley preocupaba a toda la población local.
Se trataba de un crimen en una ciudad muy pequeña y acaparó la atención de todo el mundo muy rápidamente.
La noche anterior al asesinato de Effie, se había producido otro incidente en la propiedad de los Radley. Alguien había atacado a Michael Radley a la puerta del trastero.
¿Qué sucede?
Mi hijo acaba de llegar a casa. En el trastero alguien le ha dado un golpe en la cabeza por detrás.
¿Sabe quién ha sido?
No lo sé, y tampoco sé si se ha desmayado o qué.
No habían robado nada. Y eso llevó a la policía a pensar que Michael había sorprendido a su atacante antes de que pudiera robar nada.
La familia se quedó muy preocupada. Por la noche, en la zona era común dejar la puerta del garaje, una ventana o lo que fuera abierto, pero dejó de ser así después del acontecimiento del trastero.
Antes de este incidente, a unos 65 kilómetros de distancia, habían raptado a una mujer tras asaltar su casa. Una semana antes de eso, a otra mujer que trabajaba en una tienda de alimentación de la zona, le habían dado una paliza y la habían dejado en el almacén.
Parecía que había alguien por todo el condado en busca de mujeres. Lo que preocupaba a las mujeres era saber si se trataba de una sola persona, si solo atacaba a mujeres, y por qué buscaba a esas mujeres en concreto.
Pero los investigadores encontraron pruebas que contradecían la idea de que el intruso había entrado por la ventana de la habitación de los Radley. La noche del asesinato hacía mucho frío, pero no había huellas en el suelo bajo la ventana de la habitación.
Aquella noche heló mucho, y no había huellas en el hielo que indicaran que alguien había pasado por allí.
Y tampoco había nada extraño en la moqueta de la habitación.
La moqueta era blanca, y si alguien hubiera entrado por la ventana, habría dejado pruebas, restos de lo que hubiera pisado fuera.
De hecho, había una cesta de ropa justo delante de la ventana. Y había una capa de polvo en el alféizar que nadie había tocado.
Los investigadores incluso grabaron el alféizar de la ventana por dentro y por fuera muy de cerca. Y se ve que el polvo de dentro está sin tocar.
Parecía que el robo no había sido el móvil.
Había un bolso al lado de la ventana y una cartera en la mesilla de noche que no se llevaron. Y además ella no había sufrido ningún tipo de agresión sexual.
Los investigadores también encontraron algunos objetos personales en posesión de Michael Radley que hacían sospechar sobre el matrimonio de la pareja.
Había un DVD portátil, un bote de lubricante y varias películas que contenían material pornográfico gay de adultos.
Esto nos llevó a teorizar sobre el móvil. Seguramente había un novio en algún sitio que quizá quería deshacerse de Effie para siempre y huir con él.
Además, el informe con los datos telefónicos de Michael indicaban que había llamado frecuentemente a un hombre de 35 años que había sido uno de sus profesores del instituto. A pesar de que todo esto era sospechoso, ¿era realmente posible que este fuera el móvil del asesinato?
Esto no es Hollywood, esto es Bryceville. Y esta historia tiene mucha miga, mucho humo y espejos.
En casa de los Radley, los investigadores encontraron pruebas de hechos que parecían contradecir la teoría de que un intruso había entrado por la ventana la noche que asesinaron a Effie.
Las cortinas eran blancas y no había ninguna prueba. Yo incluso me puse a cuatro patas para analizar la zona en busca de alguna prueba, para pedir a los técnicos del escenario del crimen que la estudiaran. Pero no encontré nada, nada.
La hermana de Michael Radley vivía al lado, y ella tampoco había oído nada que indicara que habían irrumpido en la casa.
La hermana de Michael Radley, su marido, tenían 8 perros de caza en una especie de corral y otros 2 sueltos. Y según dijeron todos, no se oyó ladrar a los perros la noche del ataque.
Además, los amigos de Michael contaron a los investigadores que él había realizado comentarios despectivos sobre su mujer.
Había dicho a sus amigos que odiaba a su mujer y que no podía pagar los gastos de un hijo. Así que en el matrimonio de Michael Radley había mucho más de lo que se veía en la superficie.
Según la familia de Effie, también habían ocurrido más incidentes inquietantes. Una vez, Effie iba conduciendo al trabajo por la carretera y Michael la llamó para pedirle que mirara en la guantera y ver si su medicación estaba allí.
Casi tuvo un accidente con el coche. Sus amigas me dijeron que estaba histérica cuando llegó al trabajo. Sí, tenía miedo a los ratones. Pero no estamos seguros si fue Michael o no.
Los investigadores también se enteraron de que Effie tenía un seguro de vida de $150.000 y que Michael era el beneficiario. Al reconstruir los hechos y analizar las salpicaduras de sangre, los investigadores llegaron a la conclusión de que el asesino quedó cubierto de sangre. Los científicos realizaron diversas pruebas con la bata que Michael llevaba puesta la noche del asesinato de su mujer.
Busqué sangre en la bata, pero no encontré. Me sorprendió.
Buscamos por toda la casa. Armas, huellas dactilares, muestras de ADN y todo tipo de muestras de sangre o cualquier cosa que tuviera algo de ADN.
Pero los investigadores no encontraron nada. Ni arma del crimen, ni ropa ensangrentada, ni cualquier otra prueba del asesinato. Sin embargo, en la camioneta de Michael, los investigadores encontraron un compartimento escondido debajo del asiento de atrás. Allí descubrieron un tesoro, gran número de pruebas forenses.
El premio estaba en la camioneta de Michael. Parecía que se lo había dejado adrede, porque fue muy fácil.
Había un martillo, un cúter, un trozo de cable eléctrico quemado y varios pares de guantes.
Michael Radley dijo que le sorprendió mucho que encontraran esos objetos en su camioneta.
Sus palabras fueron: Dios mío, así parece que he matado a mi mujer.
Michael insistió en que no era el asesino y en que alguien le había tendido una trampa.
Michael pensaba que alguien había puesto aquellos objetos en su camioneta y que posiblemente se trataba de la misma persona que le había atacado en el trastero.
El trozo de cable quemado se comparó con el cable que encontraron en la casa de los Radley, que se había...
Y coincidían.
Solo con las pruebas del cable se acabó con la teoría del intruso.
Aquello demostró que la persona que había realizado el asesinato se había molestado también en coger los cables y meterlos en el compartimento secreto de Michael Radley. Y eso es increíble.
Pero había una pregunta que preocupaba a los investigadores. Si Michael Radley quería matar a su mujer, ¿por qué se había molestado en rescatarla del incendio de la casa tan solo un mes antes?
Intento no pensar en lo que podría haber pasado si no me hubiera despertado. Da miedo pensarlo.
Hizo pensar a todo el mundo por qué había rescatado a su mujer. No sabemos si había intentado matarla con aquel incendio. Nadie lo sabe.
Michael Radley insistió en que un intruso había entrado en el cuarto de su mujer por la ventana. La había atacado y había huido del lugar de los hechos sin dejar ninguna pista. También decía que el asesino había escondido el arma del crimen y los guantes en un compartimento secreto de su camioneta.
Dijo que quería a su mujer, que nunca le haría eso, que acababa de dar a luz a su hijo y que no tenía ninguna razón para hacerlo.
Su historia era difícil de creer, pero ¿podría la ciencia forense ofrecer respuestas? El martillo ensangrentado que se encontró en la camioneta de Michael fue lo primero que se analizó.
De ahí fue de donde saqué la prueba de ADN. Y esta indicó que se trataba de Effie Radley.
Los análisis de los examinadores médicos concluyeron que el martillo había producido las heridas que Effie Radley tenía en la cabeza. Posteriores pruebas de ADN determinaron que la sangre del papel de cocina y de los guantes encontrados en la camioneta de Michael era de Effie. Pero no encontraron ningún resto de ADN dentro de los guantes más gruesos. Así que los científicos buscaron células de piel muerta dentro de los guantes de látex.
Encontramos ADN de Michael Radley en los guantes de látex. Era lógico pensar que se había puesto los guantes de látex y luego se había puesto los guantes más gruesos. Y luego había cogido el arma del crimen para matar a su mujer.
El padre de Michael Radley tenía sangre por todo el cuerpo. Había intentado salvarla y la había cogido, pero Michael Radley ni siquiera la había tocado. Si hubiera pensado que se trataba de un accidente, hubiese intentado averiguar qué le pasaba, pero no tenía ni una mancha de sangre. Así que la ausencia de sangre era una ventaja para nosotros.
Los abogados defensores creen que Michael Radley había planeado la muerte de su mujer durante meses y había realizado más de un intento de asesinato. El primero pudo ser el incidente del coche con los ratones, y aquí casi consiguió que tuviera un accidente en la carretera. El incendio de la casa también fue sospechoso. Los abogados defensores creen que Michael había desconectado los detectores de humos y había iniciado el incendio cerca del calentador de pañales, mientras Effie estaba dormida. Michael cogió a su hijo recién nacido y salió corriendo. El fuego bloqueaba la salida de Effie. Pero los familiares y los vecinos vieron el humo y llegaron al lugar de los hechos antes de que las llamas engulleran toda la casa. Así que Michael seguramente sintió que no tenía más opción que intentar salvar a su mujer. Así que rompió una de las ventanas y la ayudó a salir. Al hacer eso, se le consideró un héroe.
Effie, ¿estás bien?
Un mes más tarde, mientras vivían con sus padres, Michael se inventó la historia de que un ladrón que quería entrar en el trastero le había golpeado en la cabeza. Su plan era dar la impresión de que había un ladrón suelto por el barrio. Al día siguiente, según creen los abogados defensores, cortó la mosquitera de la habitación. Esperó a que Effie se fuera a la cama, se quitó la ropa, se puso 2 pares de guantes y utilizó un martillo para golpear y matar a su mujer. La sangre salpicó las paredes y le salpicó a él. Usó el papel de cocina para limpiarse y luego se puso la bata. Eso explica por qué no estuviera manchado de sangre cuando llegó la policía. Michael escondió las pruebas en un compartimento secreto de su camioneta y después corrió a la habitación de sus padres para informarles del ataque.
Michael Radley pensó que él era la última persona a la que investigarían y que el último sitio donde mirarían sería su camioneta. Se confundió en las dos cosas.
Michael Radley asesinó a su mujer porque... ¿Cómo iba un extraño a matar a su mujer y a molestarse en dejar luego el arma del crimen dentro de la camioneta de Michael Radley?
Los padres de Effie creen que Michael ya no quería seguir casado con ella, pero que no quería tener los compromisos económicos de un divorcio.
Yo creo firmemente que no quería seguir casado con ella, y en su cabeza esa era la salida. En su cabeza esa era la única salida, porque si se divorciaba, iba a tener que ser un padre de fin de semana y pagar la manutención de Aiden hasta que cumpliera los 18.
Recibió al menos 7 golpes de martillo en la cabeza. El múltiple impacto de todas esas heridas le causaron fracturas craneales, daños cerebrales y hemorragias e hinchazón.
En julio de 2009, Michael Radley fue acusado y condenado por asesinato en primer grado y sentenciado a cadena perpetua sin libertad condicional.
Por la cara puede que la gente parezca una cosa, pero cuando investigas un poco más te das cuenta de que eso cambia. Entonces ves el verdadero carácter de la persona.
Michael es un monstruo desalmado. Me cuesta pensar en el porqué. ¿Por qué alguien puede hacer una cosa de esa magnitud? Pero hay muchos mentirosos en el mundo.
En este tipo de escenario del crimen, por cómo se presentó todo y por la cantidad de pruebas que nos dejó, lo hicimos genial. No se podía hacer mejor.
The house looked ordinary, the kind of place you could drive past 100 times without ever slowing down, tucked into a quiet neighborhood not far from Toronto where lawns were trimmed, curtains drawn just enough to suggest privacy but not secrecy. Where nothing ever seemed to happen, and that was exactly why no one noticed the subtle wrongness, not at first, not when the porch light flickered a second too long in the evenings, not when the windows stayed dark even at hours when most families would be gathered inside, laughing over dinner or arguing about something trivial, because from the outside everything was carefully arranged to feel normal, almost painfully normal, and that illusion held until the night the silence began to feel heavier than it should. Until the absence of sound started to press in on the walls like something alive, something waiting, because inside that house lived 2 people who did not experience the world the way others did. 2 people whose connection was built not on love as most would understand it but on something far colder, far more calculated, a shared hunger that had been growing quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And by the time anyone realized what had been happening behind those walls, it was already too late, because the story of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka does not begin with a crime scene or a police report or even a missing person, it begins with a feeling. A shift so subtle it almost escapes notice, The kind of shift that only becomes clear in hindsight when every detail rearranges itself into something horrifyingly coherent. Because what makes this case so deeply unsettling is not just what they did but how long they were able to exist in plain sight, blending into a world that never suspected the darkness forming just beneath its surface. And if you listen closely, if you strip away the headlines and the shock and the years of retelling, what remains is something far more disturbing, a slow unraveling that begins in ordinary places, with ordinary people, until suddenly it isn't ordinary at all. Until the first cracks appear and everything starts to fall apart in ways no one could have predicted, and it is in that moment, right before the truth surfaces, that this story truly begins, not with certainty but with unease, not with answers but with questions. Because somewhere in that quiet neighborhood, behind a door that looked like any other, something had already gone terribly, irreversibly wrong, and the world simply hadn't caught up yet, not to the reality of what was happening, not to the lives that had already been pulled into that darkness. Not to the terrifying realization that the people responsible were not hiding in shadows or lurking in distant places but standing in the open, smiling, speaking, living as though nothing was amiss, and that is what makes this opening so difficult to grasp, because there is no obvious beginning. No single moment you can point to and say this is where everything changed. Instead there is only a gradual descent, a quiet accumulation of choices and actions that build upon each other until the weight becomes unbearable, until the truth forces its way into the light, and when it does, it doesn't arrive gently, it crashes through every illusion, every assumption, every fragile sense of safety that once existed, leaving behind a story that feels less like a sequence of events and more like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion, a nightmare where the danger was always there, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. And as we step into this story, as we begin to trace its origins and follow its path, it is important to remember that what you are about to hear is not fiction. Not something crafted for entertainment or shock value, but a real series of events that shattered real lives, that exposed the darkest corners of human behavior in ways that still echo years later, because once you understand what happened here, once you see how it all fits together, it becomes impossible to look at the ordinary world in quite the same way again, and that is the true weight of this case, the realization that sometimes the most terrifying stories are not the ones that happen in distant places or under extraordinary circumstances but the ones that unfold quietly, patiently, in the middle of everyday life, where no one is looking, where no one expects anything to be wrong, until suddenly everything is. In the late 1980s, the eastern edge of Toronto stretched outward into neighborhoods that felt suspended between city life and suburban calm, places where the rhythm of daily existence followed a predictable pattern. Where mornings began with the low hum of traffic heading downtown and evenings settled into a quiet that felt almost protective, as though nothing truly dangerous could take root there, and in many ways Scarborough embodied that illusion perfectly, with its rows of modest homes, its schools filled with teenagers planning futures that still felt wide open, its parks where families gathered under the assumption that the world beyond their immediate surroundings was far more chaotic than anything that could happen here, and yet beneath that sense of normalcy, something had already begun to fracture, something subtle enough that it slipped through unnoticed, a series of incidents that would later be stitched together into a pattern so disturbing it would redefine how people in this community understood safety itself. Because around this time reports started to surface, scattered at first, almost easy to dismiss in isolation, accounts from young women describing encounters that left them shaken, stories of being followed, of sudden attacks in the dark, of a presence that seemed to appear without warning and vanish just as quickly, and while each incident carried its own weight, its own fear, it was only in retrospect that the full scope of what was happening began to emerge. The realization that these were not isolated events but fragments of a single, escalating narrative, one that pointed to a perpetrator moving through the area with a confidence that suggested not only familiarity but a growing boldness, and as investigators struggled to connect the dots, the media gave this unseen figure a name, the Scarborough Rapist, a label that both identified the threat and amplified it, turning a series of crimes into a shared fear that spread through the community like a shadow stretching longer each night. And yet even as that fear took hold, life continued in its usual patterns, because fear alone is rarely enough to disrupt the routines people cling to, especially when the danger remains faceless, abstract, something that happens to others rather than to you, until the moment it doesn't. Until the moment the line between observer and victim disappears, and it is within this environment, this uneasy balance between normalcy and growing dread, that the story of Paul Bernardo begins to take a clearer shape, though at the time no one would have recognized it for what it was. Because Bernardo did not stand out in any obvious way, he blended in, presenting himself as someone who belonged in these neighborhoods, someone who understood their rhythms, their expectations, their blind spots, and that ability to move unnoticed became one of his most dangerous traits. Allowing him to operate in plain sight while suspicion drifted elsewhere, never quite settling where it needed to, and while his actions during this period were already deeply disturbing, they were only part of a larger trajectory. One that would intersect with another life in a way that would amplify everything, intensify it, transform isolated acts into something far more coordinated, far more deliberate, and that intersection came in the form of Carla Homolka, whose own background painted a picture that, on the surface, seemed entirely disconnected from the darkness that would later define her. She grew up in a household that, to outsiders, appeared stable, structured, the kind of environment that suggested predictability rather than chaos, and yet beneath that surface there were complexities, tensions. The kinds of undercurrents that rarely draw attention until something forces them into view, and when she met Bernardo, those undercurrents found a direction, a focal point, a relationship that would quickly move beyond anything resembling ordinary. Because what developed between them was not simply attraction or companionship but a dynamic built on control, on shared secrets, on a gradual erosion of boundaries that might have otherwise kept them tethered to the norms of the world around them, and as their relationship deepened, it began to create a space where behavior that would have been unthinkable in isolation became possible, even normalized within the context of their connection, and this is where the setting of this story becomes crucial, because it is not just about the physical locations, the houses, the streets, the schools, but about the psychological landscape that allowed all of this to unfold, a landscape where appearances mattered, where maintaining the image of normalcy could overshadow the need to question what lay beneath, where small signs of something being wrong could be overlooked or rationalized until they accumulated into something impossible to ignore, and as the late 1980s gave way to the early 1990s, that accumulation was already well underway, though few could see it clearly. Because the pieces were still scattered, still disconnected, and the people who might have been able to connect them were working with incomplete information, limited by the tools and understanding available at the time, and perhaps most critically, by the assumption that the worst possibilities were just that, possibilities, not realities unfolding in real time, and so the setting holds steady on the surface, the neighborhoods remain quiet, the routines continue, the illusion persists. Even as the foundation beneath it begins to shift in ways that will soon become impossible to ignore, because what is being built here is not just a sequence of events but a convergence, a point where individual histories, personal choices, and environmental factors collide to create something far more dangerous than any single element could have produced on its own, and by the time that convergence fully reveals itself, the setting that once felt so safe will be forever altered. Its familiar streets and homes redefined by the knowledge of what took place within them, a knowledge that cannot be undone, only carried forward as a reminder that even the most ordinary places can become the backdrop for something profoundly disturbing when the right conditions align. Before the names became headlines, before their faces were printed across newspapers and spoken in courtrooms with a weight that would never fully fade, they were simply girls moving through ordinary days, their lives unfolding in the quiet, unremarkable ways that most lives do. Shaped by small routines and future plans that felt distant but certain, and to understand what was taken, you have to begin there, in those moments that seemed too simple to ever be significant. Because it is in the details of who they were that the true gravity of what happened begins to settle in, not as an abstract tragedy but as a series of deeply personal losses that ripple outward, touching families, communities, and anyone who dares to look closely enough to see beyond the headlines. And one of those lives belonged to Leslie Mahaffey, a 14-year-old girl growing up in a world that still felt wide with possibility, the kind of teenager who existed in that fragile space between childhood and independence, where rules were tested, boundaries pushed just enough to feel like freedom but never enough to suggest real danger, at least not the kind of danger that would come for her, and on the surface her life reflected the rhythms of many families in Canada at the time, school days that blurred into evenings at home, conversations with friends that stretched late into the night, a sense of normalcy that felt so constant it was almost invisible, and yet within that normalcy there were tensions, small conflicts that felt significant in the way only teenage disagreements can. moments where expectations collided with a growing desire for independence, and it was within one of those moments that the path of her life shifted, not dramatically at first but just enough to place her in a position where vulnerability could take hold. Because sometimes it is not a single reckless decision that changes everything but a series of small, human choices that, in another context, would have meant nothing at all. And as the night settled in, as the familiar surroundings of her neighborhood took on that quiet stillness that so often feels safe, there was no indication of what was waiting beyond that sense of security, no sign that the world she understood was about to fracture in a way that would never be repaired. And the tragedy of her story lies not only in what happened but in how ordinary everything felt right up until the moment it didn't, how the line between safety and danger can exist so close together that it becomes invisible until it is crossed. And when Leslie disappeared, the absence she left behind was immediate and unmistakable, a silence where there should have been movement, a break in routine that set off a chain reaction of fear and urgency, because missing persons cases carry a particular kind of dread, one rooted in uncertainty. In the space between hope and the growing realization that something is very wrong, and for her family, that space became a place of waiting, of searching, of holding on to the possibility that she would return even as time began to stretch in ways that made that hope harder to sustain. And then there was Kristen French, 15 years old, her life similarly defined by the everyday details that rarely seem noteworthy until they are all that remain. She walked familiar streets, attended school, existed within a network of relationships that grounded her in a sense of belonging. And on the day she was taken, there was nothing outwardly different about the world around her. The daylight still held its usual clarity, the path from school to home was one she had traveled before, and that is what makes her story so unsettling. The way it disrupts the assumption that danger waits in darkness or isolation, because in her case it arrived in the open, in a moment that should have been entirely routine, transforming something as simple as walking home into a point of no return, and when she vanished. The shock that followed carried a different texture, one shaped by the visibility of the event, by the knowledge that this had not happened in secrecy but in plain sight, and that realization deepened the fear, extending it beyond her immediate circle into the wider community. Because if something like this could happen here, in daylight, in a place that felt familiar, then the boundaries people relied on to define safety began to dissolve, and alongside these stories there is another, one that predates them but is no less significant, the story of Tammy Homolka, whose life was intertwined with the very person who would ultimately play a role in her death, a connection that adds a layer of betrayal so profound it is difficult to fully comprehend, because trust within a family is often seen as absolute, a foundation that does not require questioning. And yet in this case that foundation was quietly undermined, replaced with something far darker, and Tammy, like the others, existed within her own set of ordinary moments, family gatherings, shared spaces. A life that should have been defined by growth and possibility rather than by the actions of those closest to her, and when her life ended, the truth of what had happened was hidden, obscured by a narrative that allowed those responsible to continue moving forward without immediate consequence. And this concealment becomes part of the broader story, a reminder that not all losses are immediately understood for what they are, that sometimes the reality of a situation remains buried until something forces it into the open, and when you look at these lives together, when you consider the threads that connect them, what emerges is not just a list of victims but a deeper understanding of what was taken, not only the years they would have lived but the futures they were building, the relationships they would have formed, the countless moments that will never exist, and it is in this recognition that the narrative shifts from abstraction to something far more personal, because these were not just names attached to a case. They were individuals with identities that extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths, and to reduce them solely to what happened to them would be to overlook the fullness of who they were, and so this part of the story holds space for that fullness. For the acknowledgement that before everything changed, before the darkness that would come to define this case, there were lives unfolding in ways that felt entirely their own, lives that deserved to continue, and it is that understanding that makes what follows not just disturbing but deeply, irrevocably tragic. The night did not announce itself as anything unusual, it arrived the way countless nights do, settling over the quiet streets with a kind of calm that feels almost protective, the air cooling just enough to invite people indoors, lights flickering on behind curtains, doors closing. Routines unfolding in familiar patterns, and yet within that ordinary rhythm there was a fracture forming, a moment that would separate everything that came before from everything that would follow, though no one standing under that night sky could have sensed it. No one could have known that somewhere within the stillness, a decision had already been made, a line already crossed in the minds of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, a line that would not only alter their own lives but tear through the lives of others with a force that could never be undone. And what makes this moment so difficult to grasp is not just the violence that would unfold but the way it was woven into the fabric of normal life, how it began in spaces that should have been safe, in moments that should have been unremarkable, and yet became something else entirely. Something controlled, deliberate, and profoundly disturbing, because by the time the events truly began, the groundwork had already been laid, the patterns of behavior established, the boundaries eroded to the point where what followed felt, to them, like a continuation rather than an escalation. And it is within that mindset that the incident takes shape, not as a sudden outburst but as a progression, a chilling extension of something that had been building quietly over time, and when they targeted Leslie Mahaffey. The act itself unfolded with a calculated precision that speaks to that progression, the choice of moment, the awareness of surroundings, the ability to move through the environment without drawing immediate attention. All of it suggesting a level of control that makes the outcome feel inevitable once the initial step was taken, and for Leslie, the transition from the familiar world she knew into the reality she was pulled into happened in an instant, a shift so abrupt it leaves no space for comprehension. No time to understand what is happening or why, only the immediate recognition that something is wrong, profoundly wrong, and that recognition becomes the backdrop for everything that follows, because from that point on, the events are no longer shaped by her choices but by the intentions of those who have taken control, and inside that house, the same house that from the outside appeared so unremarkable, the atmosphere changes completely, the quiet no longer comforting but oppressive. Every second stretching under the weight of what is being done, and it is here that the true nature of the incident reveals itself, not just in the physical actions but in the dynamic between the two perpetrators, the way they interact, the roles they assume. The shared understanding that allows them to operate in sync, reinforcing each other's behavior in a way that removes hesitation, that replaces any lingering boundary with a sense of permission, and this dynamic is crucial. Because it transforms the situation from something that might have been stopped, interrupted, questioned, into something that continues, intensifies, becomes more entrenched with each passing moment, and when the incident reaches its conclusion, when Leslie's life is taken. The act itself does not bring an end to the sequence but rather opens the door to what comes next, the attempts to erase what has happened, to remove the evidence, to return the world outside those walls to its previous state of unawareness. And this is where the calculated nature of their actions becomes even more apparent, the steps taken not in panic but with a disturbing level of deliberation, as though the aftermath was always part of the plan, and yet even as those actions unfold, even as they work to conceal the reality of what has taken place, the impact of the incident is already extending outward, though unseen, though not yet understood, it is moving into the lives of those connected to Leslie, into the spaces she once occupied. Creating an absence that will soon demand explanation, and that demand will set into motion a chain of events that cannot be controlled in the same way, that cannot be contained within the walls of that house, and still, before that chain fully begins, before the wider world becomes aware. There is a brief, unsettling moment where everything appears unchanged, where the streets remain quiet, the routines continue, the illusion of normalcy holds, and it is within that moment that the true weight of what has happened becomes almost unbearable, because it exists without acknowledgement. Without consequence, suspended in a space where only those responsible know the truth, and that knowledge, that imbalance between what has occurred and what is known, is what gives this part of the story its deepest sense of unease. Because it reminds us that the most significant events do not always announce themselves immediately, that sometimes they unfold in silence, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they can no longer be contained, and as this incident settles into the timeline of the case. As it becomes one of several that will define what is to come, it carries with it not only the loss of a life but the confirmation that something far more dangerous is at work, something that will not end here, something that has already proven it can continue, escalate, repeat. And that realization, though not yet fully formed in the minds of those outside this narrative, is already embedded in the sequence of events, shaping everything that will follow in ways that cannot be undone. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a crime scene but from an absence, a silence that settled where there should have been movement, where there should have been a familiar return home, and when Leslie Mahaffey did not come back, the shift was immediate for those who knew her. A subtle unease turning quickly into alarm as minutes stretched into hours, and that is how so many investigations begin, not with evidence neatly arranged but with a void that demands to be filled, a question that refuses to stay unanswered. And in the early stages there is always that fragile balance between hope and fear, the instinct to believe that there is an explanation that does not involve harm, that the missing person will reappear with a story that makes sense of the delay, but as time passes that hope begins to erode. Replaced by a growing urgency that pulls families and authorities into a search that expands outward in widening circles, starting with the places she was last seen, the routes she would have taken, the people she might have encountered. Each step an attempt to reconstruct a timeline that has already been broken, and as investigators move through those initial stages, they rely on fragments, small details that might otherwise seem insignificant, a sighting here, a conversation there. The memory of someone who thinks they saw something but cannot quite be certain, and it is within those fragments that the first hints of a pattern begin to emerge, though at this point it is still too early to see it clearly. Too early to connect this disappearance to anything beyond the immediate circumstances, and then the search shifts, because missing person cases have a way of changing direction when hope gives way to a more sobering possibility. When the question is no longer where is she but what has happened to her, and it is in that transition that the discovery phase begins to take on a different tone, one that carries a weight that is difficult to articulate. A sense that the answers being sought may not bring relief but confirmation of the worst fears, and when the remains are eventually found, when the reality of what has occurred can no longer be held at a distance, the investigation moves into a new and far more complex stage, because a crime scene, especially one that has been deliberately altered, does not present itself as a clear narrative. It offers pieces, scattered, incomplete, sometimes intentionally obscured, and it becomes the task of investigators to gather those pieces and attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events. To read what has been left behind and translate it into something that can be understood, and in this case the condition of the remains, the way they were discovered, speaks to an effort not just to conceal but to dismantle, to erase identity, to remove the possibility of easy recognition. And that alone tells investigators something crucial about the nature of the crime, that it was not impulsive but calculated, that the person or people responsible took steps to avoid detection, to delay discovery, and yet even in those efforts there are traces. There are details that cannot be fully controlled, and those details become the foundation of the investigation, the starting points from which everything else must be built, and as forensic teams work through the evidence, documenting, analyzing, preserving what they can, the broader context begins to come into focus, the realization that this is not an isolated event in the sense of randomness but something that may connect to other incidents, other reports, other unsolved cases that have lingered without resolution. And this is where the earlier accounts from the Scarborough area begin to resurface, the memory of a series of attacks that had once seemed separate now taking on a new significance, because the possibility that they are linked introduces a level of urgency that reshapes the entire investigation, turning it from a single case into something potentially far larger, and as that possibility takes hold, investigators must navigate not only the evidence in front of them but the gaps between cases, the differences and similarities that might indicate a common thread. And this process is rarely straightforward. It involves revisiting old files, re-examining assumptions, questioning conclusions that were once considered solid, and all the while the pressure continues to build, because the knowledge that a perpetrator may still be active, still moving through the same communities, adds a layer of immediacy that cannot be ignored, and within that pressure there are moments where the investigation seems to stall, where leads do not lead anywhere, where the available evidence raises more questions than it answers. And those moments are some of the most difficult, because they test the persistence of those involved, the ability to continue searching even when the path forward is unclear, and yet it is often within those periods of uncertainty that the most important connections begin to form, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as pieces that once seemed unrelated start to align, and in the background of all of this there are the families, waiting, watching, trying to make sense of a reality that has shifted beyond recognition. Their lives now defined by a search for answers that may never feel sufficient, because even when the facts are uncovered, even when the sequence of events is understood, there remains a gap that cannot be filled, the absence that first signaled something was wrong. And that absence becomes a constant, a reminder of what has been lost and what cannot be restored, and so the discovery phase of this case is not just about finding evidence or identifying a crime scene, it is about the gradual unveiling of a truth that was hidden, deliberately obscured. And the effort to bring that truth into the light, knowing that in doing so it will confirm a reality that is as devastating as it is undeniable, and as the investigation continues to move forward, as more pieces are gathered and the picture becomes clearer. There is an underlying awareness that what has been uncovered so far may only be part of a larger story, one that has yet to fully reveal itself, and that awareness drives the search onward, pushing investigators to look beyond the obvious, to question what lies beneath the surface. Because in cases like this, the first discovery is rarely the last, and the truth, when it finally emerges, is often far more complex and far more disturbing than anyone initially imagined. By the time the investigation widened, the sense of urgency had already settled into something heavier, more persistent, the kind of pressure that lingers in every decision, every interview, every late-night review of evidence. Because what investigators were facing was no longer a single incident but the possibility of a pattern, a thread that might connect multiple acts of violence across time and space, and that possibility changes everything. It reshapes how each detail is interpreted, how each lead is pursued. And yet it also introduces a complexity that can easily lead the investigation into dead ends, because patterns can be deceptive, they can suggest connections that do not exist while obscuring the ones that do, and so the process becomes one of constant recalibration. Of testing hypotheses against the available evidence, of following paths that sometimes stretch far beyond the original scope of the case, only to circle back with nothing concrete to show for the effort. And it is within this landscape of uncertainty that the focus begins to shift toward potential suspects, individuals whose names surface through tips, prior records, or proximity to the victims, and each of these names carries with it a set of questions. A possibility that must be explored thoroughly before it can be dismissed, because the cost of overlooking the right suspect is too high to risk, and yet the majority of these leads, despite initial promise, begin to unravel under scrutiny, alibis hold, timelines do not align. Physical evidence fails to support the suspicion, and with each lead that fades, the frustration grows, not just among investigators but within the wider community, where fear continues to build without a clear target, without a sense of resolution, and in this atmosphere. Even the smallest piece of information can take on disproportionate importance, a partial description, a vague memory, a detail that might connect one case to another, and so these fragments are gathered, catalogued, compared, sometimes leading to new lines of inquiry. Sometimes reinforcing existing ones, but rarely providing the definitive answer that is needed, and during this phase, the earlier series of assaults attributed to the Scarborough rapist begin to occupy a more central place in the investigation, not as isolated crimes but as potential precursors. Indicators of a behavior pattern that may have evolved over time, and this connection, while compelling, also complicates matters, because it expands the timeline, increases the number of potential victims, and introduces a wider geographic range that must be considered. Stretching resources and attention across multiple jurisdictions, each with its own records, its own investigative history, its own set of unresolved questions, and coordinating these elements becomes a challenge in itself, requiring communication and collaboration that is not always seamless. Especially in a time when information sharing is not as immediate or integrated as it would later become, and within this broader framework, the name Paul Bernardo does surface, but not in a way that immediately sets him apart from other potential suspects. He is one of many individuals whose background, behavior, or proximity places him within the scope of inquiry, and while there are aspects of his profile that align with the emerging pattern, they do not, at this stage, form a complete or conclusive picture, and so he remains on the periphery. Noted but not yet central, and this is one of the most unsettling aspects of this phase of the investigation, the knowledge, in hindsight, that the person responsible could be identified within the pool of suspects yet still remain unrecognized. Not because of a lack of effort but because the available evidence has not yet converged in a way that makes the connection undeniable, and alongside him, there are others, individuals who draw attention for various reasons, some due to past offenses, others due to circumstantial links. And each of these cases is examined with the same level of detail, the same commitment to uncovering the truth, and yet again and again the trail leads to nothing definitive, leaving investigators to return to the evidence, to reassess, to look for what might have been missed. And it is in these moments of reassessment that the investigation often feels like it is moving in circles, revisiting the same information, asking the same questions, searching for a new angle that might break the cycle, and this repetition, while necessary, can be mentally and emotionally exhausting, because it reinforces the sense that the answer is just out of reach, that the pieces are there but not yet aligned in the right way, and during this time, the public perception of the case continues to evolve, shaped by media coverage, by speculation, by the natural human need to find explanations for events that defy understanding, and this perception can influence the flow of information, generating new tips, some useful, many not, adding to the volume of data that must be processed, and within this flood of information, distinguishing between what is relevant and what is not becomes increasingly difficult, requiring a level of discipline and focus that is not easy to maintain over extended periods, especially when the stakes remain so high, because with each passing day, the awareness grows that the perpetrator, whoever they may be, is still out there, still capable of causing harm, and that awareness drives the investigation forward even when progress feels minimal, even when the path ahead is unclear, and it is within this tension, between persistence and uncertainty, that the groundwork is laid for the breakthrough that will eventually come, because even though this phase is marked by dead ends and false leads, it is also a period of accumulation, of gathering information that, while not immediately useful, will later become critical when viewed from a different perspective, and so the investigation continues, methodical, relentless, moving through each possibility with the understanding that somewhere within this complex web of details, there is a connection waiting to be recognized. A piece of evidence that will shift everything, and until that moment arrives, the process remains one of searching, questioning, and enduring the uncertainty that defines cases where the truth has not yet fully revealed itself. The turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation but as a slow tightening of threads that had been drifting separately for far too long, a moment where fragments that once seemed incomplete began to align with a clarity that could no longer be ignored, and in cases like this, that alignment often comes from something deceptively small, a detail that might have been overlooked before, a piece of evidence that gains new meaning when placed beside something else, and here it was the convergence of forensic science, persistence, and a growing willingness to re-examine earlier assumptions that finally began to shift the direction of the investigation, because among the many leads that had been explored, one element had remained unresolved. The biological evidence collected from the earlier assaults attributed to the Scarborough rapist, evidence that had been preserved but not fully utilized due to the limitations and delays of the time, and as advances in DNA analysis began to offer new possibilities. That evidence became the key to reopening a path that had once gone cold, and when the samples were finally processed and compared against potential suspects, the results pointed with increasing certainty toward Paul Bernardo. A name that had surfaced before but had never been fully connected to the broader pattern, and this time the connection was not based on circumstantial links or behavioral profiles but on something far more concrete, something that could withstand scrutiny. And that shift from suspicion to evidence marked the beginning of a new phase, one where the investigation could move forward with a clearer focus, narrowing its scope around a central figure whose involvement could no longer be dismissed, and yet even at this stage, the picture was not complete. Because while the DNA linked Bernardo to the earlier assaults, it did not, on its own, account for the full extent of what had happened, it did not explain the disappearances, the murders, the concealment of evidence. And so the challenge became one of building a case that extended beyond those initial connections, of uncovering the additional layers that would tie everything together, and it is here that the role of Karla Homolka begins to come into sharper focus. Not as a peripheral figure but as someone whose knowledge, whose actions, could provide insight into the parts of the story that remained hidden, and the process of bringing that information to light was neither straightforward nor immediate. It involved interviews, inconsistencies, shifting narratives, the gradual realization that what was being presented did not fully align with the emerging evidence, and within that tension, investigators began to see the outline of a dynamic that was far more complex than a simple perpetrator and bystander. A dynamic that suggested collaboration, shared intent, a level of involvement that challenged the initial assumptions, and as pressure mounted, as the weight of the evidence grew, the cracks in the existing narrative widened, allowing glimpses of a reality that had been carefully concealed. And then came the discovery that would redefine everything, the existence of recorded material, video evidence that documented the crimes in a way that removed ambiguity, that stripped away the possibility of denial or minimization, and when those recordings were finally recovered, They did more than confirm suspicions, they exposed the full extent of the actions, the interactions between Bernardo and Homolka, the roles each played, the level of participation that had previously been obscured, and this revelation carried a dual impact. On one hand, it provided the clarity that investigators had been seeking, the definitive proof that connected the various elements of the case into a coherent whole, and on the other hand, it introduced a profound sense of shock. Because the reality captured in those recordings was far more disturbing than many had imagined, revealing not just the acts themselves but the mindset behind them, the absence of hesitation, the normalization of behavior that defied comprehension, and from that point forward, the investigation moved with a renewed intensity, no longer searching for a suspect but building an undeniable case, assembling the evidence in a way that would withstand the scrutiny of the courtroom, and yet even as this breakthrough brought clarity, it also raised difficult questions about the path that had led here, about the delays in processing evidence, about the missed opportunities to connect the dots earlier, questions that would linger long after the case itself reached its legal conclusion. Because breakthroughs in cases like this are rarely clean or uncomplicated, they come with a recognition of what might have been done differently, of how the timeline could have unfolded in another way, and that recognition becomes part of the broader narrative. A reminder that the pursuit of justice is not only about the final outcome but about the process that leads there, and as the investigation transitioned from uncertainty to resolution, the focus shifted toward what would come next, the legal proceedings. The confrontation between evidence and defense, the moment where the truth that had been uncovered would be presented in full, and while the breakthrough had provided the answers that had once seemed out of reach, it also marked the beginning of a new phase, one where those answers would be tested, challenged, and ultimately used to determine the consequences for those responsible, and in that transition, the case moved from the realm of investigation into the arena of judgment, carrying with it the weight of everything that had been uncovered and everything that still needed to be confronted. The courtroom did not feel like a place where truth simply appeared, it felt like a space where truth had to be forced into the open, shaped, argued over, resisted, and finally pinned down under the weight of evidence that could no longer be denied. And as proceedings began, the atmosphere carried a tension that was both immediate and cumulative, built from years of fear, investigation, and unanswered questions, all now converging in a room where every word mattered, every detail carried consequence, and at the center of it all sat Paul Bernardo. No longer an abstract figure or a name in a file but a visible presence, a man whose ordinary appearance stood in stark contrast to the gravity of what he was accused of, and across from him the legal machinery of the state moved with deliberate precision. Presenting a case that had been assembled piece by piece, evidence layered upon evidence until the narrative it formed became difficult to challenge, and yet the courtroom is not a place of simple conclusions, it is a place of contest, where even the most compelling evidence must be tested. Where defense and prosecution engage in a process that is as much about interpretation as it is about fact, and within that process the role of Karla Homolka became one of the most controversial and unsettling aspects of the entire case, because by the time the trial unfolded, a deal had already been made, an agreement reached between her and the prosecution that positioned her as a cooperating witness, a decision that would later be questioned, criticized, and debated with an intensity that reflected the public's struggle to reconcile the outcome with the reality that was being revealed, and as she took the stand, the courtroom became a space where competing narratives collided. Her testimony presenting a version of events that framed her actions within the context of coercion and control, while the emerging evidence, particularly the video recordings, suggested a level of participation that complicated that narrative in ways that could not be easily dismissed. And this tension between what was said and what was shown created an atmosphere that was almost unbearable at times, because it forced everyone present to confront not only the facts of the case but the ambiguity of human behavior. The possibility that roles within such crimes are not always as clearly defined as one might hope, and as the prosecution laid out its case against Bernardo, the structure of the narrative became increasingly difficult to refute, the forensic evidence, the timeline of events, the corroborating details that connected one incident to another, all building toward a conclusion that pointed with certainty to his responsibility for the crimes, and the impact of this presentation extended beyond the legal arguments, it resonated with the families of the victims, with the broader public, with anyone who had followed the case and was now witnessing the culmination of years of uncertainty, and yet even within this process, there were moments where the limitations of the system became visible. where the prior agreement with Homolka cast a shadow over the proceedings, raising questions about whether justice could ever be fully realized when one of the central figures had already secured a reduced sentence. And these questions did not disrupt the legal process itself, but they lingered in the background, shaping the way the outcome would be perceived once it was delivered, and when the verdict finally came, when the court found Bernardo guilty on multiple counts including murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, the sense of resolution was immediate but not absolute, because while the conviction represented a clear acknowledgement of his actions and a definitive assignment of responsibility, it did not erase the complexities that had emerged throughout the trial. It did not resolve the discomfort surrounding the deal that had been made, and as the sentence of life imprisonment was handed down, it carried with it both the weight of justice and the recognition of its imperfections, and for the families, for those most directly affected. The moment was one of profound emotion, a mixture of relief, grief, and perhaps a lingering sense that no outcome could fully account for what had been lost, and outside the courtroom, the reaction was equally complex, public discourse shaped by a combination of outrage, reflection, and a renewed scrutiny of the systems that had handled the case, because high-profile trials do not end when the verdict is read, they continue in the conversations that follow, in the policies that may be reconsidered, in the collective memory that forms around them, and in this instance. The trial became more than a legal proceeding, it became a focal point for broader discussions about accountability, about the balance between securing testimony and ensuring proportional consequences, about the ways in which the pursuit of justice can sometimes require compromises that leave lasting unease, and as the legal chapter of the case came to a close, what remained was not a simple sense of closure but a layered understanding of what justice can and cannot achieve. A recognition that while the court had delivered its judgment, the impact of the case would continue to unfold in ways that extended far beyond that room, shaping perceptions, influencing future decisions, and leaving behind a legacy that would be revisited for years to come. When the courtroom emptied and the formal language of verdicts and sentencing faded into memory, what remained was not silence but a quieter, more persistent echo, one that settled into the lives of those who had been touched by the case and refused to dissipate. Because the end of a trial is never the end of a story like this, it is only the point where the narrative shifts from the immediacy of events to the long, uneven process of living with what has happened, and in the years that followed, the names Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka did not disappear. They lingered in public consciousness, resurfacing in discussions about justice, about accountability, about the limits of a system that must make decisions under conditions that are rarely perfect, and yet for the families of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homolka. The case was never an abstract debate, it was a permanent alteration of reality, a before and after that could not be reconciled, a space where memories existed alongside an absence that no amount of legal resolution could fill. And this is where the true weight of the aftermath begins to take shape, not in headlines or legal documents but in the daily experience of carrying loss forward, in the small, quiet moments where the impact is felt most acutely. In the recognition that life continues but never returns to what it once was, and within the broader community, particularly in places like Toronto and the surrounding areas, the case left a mark that extended beyond individual families, it altered the collective sense of safety. Reshaped the way people understood the spaces they moved through, introduced a caution that had not been as present before, because when something so disturbing emerges from within a familiar environment, it challenges the assumptions that make that environment feel secure, and those assumptions, once broken, are not easily restored, and at the same time, the case prompted a deeper examination of the systems involved, the investigative processes, the handling of evidence, the decisions made during prosecution. Particularly the agreement that allowed Homolka to serve a significantly reduced sentence, a decision that became a focal point for public frustration and debate, raising questions that did not have simple answers. Questions about how justice should be pursued when critical information is incomplete, about the balance between securing cooperation and ensuring that consequences align with actions, and these questions did not fade with time, they became part of the legacy of the case. Influencing how similar situations would be approached in the future, serving as a reminder of the complexities inherent in the pursuit of truth, and as years passed, the tangible elements of the case, the investigations, the trials, the sentences, settled into history, but the intangible elements, the emotional and psychological impact, continued to evolve, shaped by memory, by reflection, by the ongoing effort to understand something that resists easy comprehension, and within that effort there is often a search for meaning, a desire to extract some form of lesson from what has occurred. Not to justify it or diminish its severity, but to ensure that it is not simply absorbed and forgotten, and perhaps one of the most enduring lessons lies in the recognition of how ordinary the surface of this story once appeared. How the individuals involved moved through everyday life without drawing the kind of attention that might have disrupted what they were doing, and that recognition carries with it both a caution and a challenge, a caution against assuming that danger always presents itself in obvious ways, and a challenge to remain attentive, to question when something feels out of place, even if it cannot be immediately explained, and yet it is equally important to approach such lessons with care, because a world defined entirely by suspicion is not a world in which people can truly live. And so the balance becomes one of awareness without paranoia, of understanding without losing sight of the fact that cases like this, while deeply impactful, are not the totality of human experience, and in returning to the lives at the center of this story, there is a need to shift the focus away from those who caused harm and back toward those who were lost, to remember Leslie Mahaffey not as a victim alone but as a young person with a future that was interrupted. To think of Kristen French in terms of the life she was living rather than the way it ended, to acknowledge Tammy Homoka as more than a tragic detail in a larger narrative, and in doing so, to restore a measure of individuality that is often overshadowed in cases of this magnitude. Because while the story of what happened will continue to be told, analyzed, and revisited, it is the recognition of who these individuals were that ensures the narrative does not become solely defined by the actions of those who took their lives, and as this story reaches its conclusion, there is no simple resolution to offer, no sense that everything has been neatly accounted for, only an acknowledgement of the complexity, the pain, the unanswered questions that remain, and a quiet understanding that some stories do not end so much as they continue to resonate, shaping the way we see the world, the way we understand each other, and the way we carry forward the memory of those who should have had far more time than they were given. Time has a way of softening the edges of most stories, of turning even the most shocking events into something distant, something that can be discussed without the same immediacy of emotion, but there are cases that resist that process, cases that remain sharp no matter how many years pass. And this is one of them, because what happened does not sit comfortably in the past, it lingers in the present, resurfacing in conversations, in media, in the quiet thoughts of those who remember where they were when the truth first came to light, and in that sense the story never fully concludes. It evolves, shifting from a narrative of crime and punishment into something more reflective, more introspective. A lens through which people examine not only the actions of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka but the broader systems and assumptions that allowed those actions to continue for as long as they did, and within that reflection there is a recurring tension between understanding and acceptance. Because to understand how something like this can happen is not the same as accepting it, and yet without that understanding, the lessons remain incomplete, and so people return to the details, not out of morbid curiosity but out of a need to make sense of what feels inherently senseless. To trace the path from ordinary beginnings to extraordinary violence and to ask where, if anywhere, that path could have been interrupted, and these questions do not always lead to clear answers, sometimes they lead instead to a recognition of complexity, of the many variables that intersect in ways that are difficult to predict or control, and that recognition can be unsettling in its own right, because it challenges the desire for simple explanations, for clear causes and effects, and replaces it with something far less comfortable. A landscape where human behavior is influenced by a combination of factors that do not always align in predictable ways, and yet within that landscape there are still points of clarity, moments where the importance of certain actions becomes undeniable, the value of thorough investigation, the necessity of communication between agencies, the critical role of evidence and the timing of its analysis, all of which played a part in how this case unfolded, and how it might have unfolded differently under other circumstances, and beyond the procedural aspects, there is also a deeper, more personal layer to consider, the impact on those who were not directly involved but who nonetheless felt the ripple effects, the communities that re-evaluated their sense of safety, the individuals who became more cautious, more aware, sometimes more fearful. And while these changes are understandable, they also highlight the delicate balance between awareness and the ability to live without constant apprehension, because if every shadow is seen as a threat, the world becomes a much smaller, more constrained place. And so the challenge becomes one of integrating the lessons of this case without allowing them to overshadow everything else, of remembering what happened while still making space for trust, for connection, for the ordinary experiences that define most lives, and in doing so, there is an opportunity to honor those who were lost in a way that extends beyond remembrance, by contributing to a world that is more attentive, more responsive, more willing to question when something feels wrong. And at the same time more compassionate toward those who are affected by such events, recognizing that the aftermath does not follow a single path, that grief and recovery take many forms and unfold over different timelines, and as the years continue to pass, the story remains. Not as a static record but as something that continues to be interpreted, to be understood in new ways as perspectives shift and new generations encounter it for the first time, and perhaps that is where its lasting significance lies. Not only in the details of what occurred but in the ongoing conversation it generates, the way it prompts reflection on justice, on responsibility, on the structures that shape our responses to crime, and on the human capacity for both harm and resilience. And while there is no definitive endpoint to that conversation, there is a sense that each retelling, each examination, contributes to a broader awareness, a collective effort to ensure that what was learned is not lost, that the mistakes are acknowledged, that the questions remain open. And that the memory of those whose lives were taken is carried forward with the respect and seriousness it deserves, because in the end, the true conclusion of a story like this is not found in a single moment or a final statement. It is found in the way it continues to influence how we see the world and how we choose to move through it. There is a moment that comes long after the headlines fade, after the court transcripts are archived and the names that once dominated every conversation begin to appear less frequently in daily life, a moment when the story settles into something quieter but no less powerful. And it is in that space that its deeper implications begin to unfold, not as a sequence of events to be followed but as a presence that lingers, shaping perceptions in ways that are often subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet profoundly lasting. Because the case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka did more than expose a series of crimes, it revealed fractures in the way people understood trust, proximity, and the assumptions that underpin everyday interactions. It forced a reconsideration of how danger is recognized. How it can exist not at the edges of society but within its most familiar spaces, and that realization carries a weight that does not dissipate easily. It becomes part of the background against which future experiences are measured. A quiet recalibration of awareness that influences how people move through the world even when they are not consciously thinking about why. And within that recalibration there is often a tension between the desire to feel safe and the knowledge that safety is not an absolute condition but a fragile balance, one that can be disrupted in ways that are difficult to predict, and yet life continues, it has to. Because to remain fixed in that awareness would be to lose something essential, the ability to engage with the world openly, to form connections without constant suspicion, and so what emerges over time is not a permanent state of fear but a more nuanced understanding. An acknowledgement that while most interactions are harmless, there are moments where intuition, attention to detail, and a willingness to question can make a difference, and this understanding extends beyond individuals to institutions, to the systems that are responsible for responding to crime. For protecting communities, for ensuring that when something does go wrong, there are mechanisms in place to address it effectively, and in the aftermath of this case, those systems did not remain unchanged, they were examined, critiqued, adjusted. Not in a way that could erase what had happened but in a way that aimed to reduce the likelihood of similar failures in the future, and this process of reflection and adaptation is one of the few constructive outcomes that can emerge from such a tragedy. A recognition that while the past cannot be altered, the future can be shaped by what has been learned, and yet even as these broader changes take place, the personal dimension of the story remains, carried by those who were directly affected. By the families who continue to navigate a reality defined by loss, by memories that do not fade with time but instead become integrated into the fabric of their lives, shaping who they are and how they move forward, and in considering this dimension, it becomes clear that the impact of the case cannot be fully understood through statistics or legal outcomes alone. It must be viewed through the lens of human experience, through the quiet resilience required to continue in the face of something that cannot be undone, and in that sense, the story does not belong solely to the past, it exists in the present, in the ongoing effort to balance remembrance with the need to live, to honor what was lost without allowing it to define every aspect of what remains, and perhaps that is where the most meaningful reflection lies. Not in attempting to extract a single, definitive lesson, but in recognizing the complexity of the situation, the interplay of factors that contributed to it, and the ways in which it continues to resonate across different levels of society, from the individual to the institutional, from the immediate to the long term, and as this reflection unfolds, there is an opportunity to approach the story with a sense of responsibility, to engage with it not as a source of sensationalism but as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the ongoing commitment to improving the systems that are meant to protect, and in doing so, to ensure that the narrative remains grounded in respect for those who were affected. That their experiences are not reduced to mere details in a larger story but are recognized as the core of what makes this case significant, and as the years continue to pass. The hope is not that the story will be forgotten but that it will be remembered in a way that contributes to a more thoughtful, more aware, and ultimately more compassionate understanding of the world in which we live. What remains, after every detail has been examined and every argument has been made, is not a neat conclusion but a lingering presence, something that settles into the background of collective memory and refuses to be fully resolved. Because the story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka does not offer the kind of closure people often hope for, it does not end with a sense that everything has been balanced or accounted for. Instead, it leaves behind a series of reflections that continue to evolve over time, shaped by perspective, by distance, by the ongoing process of trying to understand what can never be entirely explained, and within those reflections there is a recognition that this case exists on multiple levels at once. It is a story about crime and justice, about investigation and consequence. But it is also a story about perception, about the assumptions that guide how people interpret the world around them, and how those assumptions can be challenged in ways that are both necessary and deeply unsettling. Because one of the most enduring aspects of this case is the way it disrupts the idea that danger is always visible, always external, always something that can be identified before it causes harm, and in confronting that disruption, there is a shift in awareness that extends beyond the specifics of this case into a broader understanding of human behavior, of the complexities that exist beneath the surface of everyday interactions, and yet this awareness must be handled with care. Because while it can lead to greater attentiveness, it can also lead to a kind of pervasive mistrust if taken to an extreme, and so the challenge becomes one of integration, of allowing what has been learned to inform perception without allowing it to dominate it. And this balance is not easily achieved. It requires a conscious effort to hold multiple truths at once, to acknowledge that while extraordinary acts of violence do occur, they are not the defining feature of most human experiences. And that maintaining a sense of openness and connection is still possible, even in the presence of that knowledge, and as this balance is navigated, the focus inevitably returns to those whose lives were most directly affected, to Leslie Mahaffey, to Kristen French, to Tammy Homolka, and to the families and communities that continue to carry their memory, because in the end, it is their stories that ground the narrative, that prevent it from becoming abstract, that remind us that behind every detail, every piece of evidence, every legal argument, there are real lives that were interrupted, real futures that were never realized, and in honoring that reality, there is a responsibility to approach the story with a level of respect that goes beyond recounting events, to consider the impact of how it is told, how it is remembered, how it is integrated into the broader cultural understanding of crime and justice, and this responsibility extends to the way the story is shared, the language that is used, the emphasis that is placed on certain aspects over others. Because the way a story is framed can influence how it is perceived, how it is internalized, and ultimately how it contributes to the ongoing conversation about issues that extend far beyond a single case, and in this sense, the narrative becomes part of a larger dialogue. One that includes discussions about the effectiveness of investigative practices, the ethics of plea agreements, the role of media in shaping public perception, and the ways in which society responds to acts that challenge its sense of order and safety. And while this dialogue does not lead to simple solutions, it does create space for critical reflection, for the examination of what can be improved, what can be learned, and how similar situations might be handled differently in the future, and as this reflection continues, the story itself becomes less about the individuals who committed the crimes and more about the systems and structures that surround such events, the ways in which they function, the ways in which they can fail, and the ways in which they can evolve. And in that shift there is a subtle but important change in focus, one that moves away from the sensational aspects of the case and toward a more thoughtful consideration of its implications, and perhaps that is where the final note of this narrative resides. Not in a definitive statement or a clear resolution, but in an ongoing awareness, a recognition that stories like this do not simply end, they continue to resonate, to inform, to challenge, and that in engaging with them, there is an opportunity to contribute to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the world, one that acknowledges both its capacity for harm and its potential for growth, and in holding both of those realities at once, there is a way forward that does not deny the past but also does not allow it to define the entirety of what lies ahead. There is a final layer to this story that doesn't sit in court records or police files, something quieter and more difficult to articulate, the way it settles into the subconscious long after the facts have been learned. Long after the names Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka stop being shocking and instead become something heavier, something familiar in a way that feels uncomfortable, because familiarity suggests understanding, and understanding in a case like this is never complete, it is always partial. Always leaving space for questions that do not have clear answers, and yet those questions persist, shaping the way the story is remembered, the way it is retold, the way it continues to exist not just as an event in the past but as an influence on the present. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of that influence is how it changes the way ordinary moments are perceived, how something as simple as a quiet street or a passing interaction can carry a faint echo of what was learned here, not in a way that overwhelms but in a way that lingers. A subtle awareness that beneath the surface of normal life there are layers that are not always visible, and this awareness does not come with clear instructions, it does not tell people exactly how to respond or what to do differently, it simply exists. Altering perception in ways that are often too nuanced to notice in real time, and over the years, as the story has been revisited through documentaries, articles, conversations, it has taken on different meanings for different people. For some it is a case study in investigative challenges, in the importance of timing and coordination. For others it is a reflection on the complexities of human relationships, on how dynamics between individuals can evolve into something destructive when certain boundaries are crossed and reinforced rather than challenged, and for many it remains, at its core, a story about loss, about the lives of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homolka, and the space they left behind, a space that cannot be filled but can be acknowledged, respected, remembered in ways that resist the tendency to reduce them to mere elements within a larger narrative. And this multiplicity of perspectives is part of what keeps the story alive, part of what prevents it from settling into a single, fixed interpretation, because each time it is revisited, it is filtered through a new context, a new set of experiences, a new understanding of the world, and in that process it continues to evolve, not in its facts but in its meaning, and as it evolves, it invites a kind of reflection that goes beyond the specifics of the case, encouraging a broader consideration of how people relate to one another, how trust is built and sometimes misplaced, how warning signs can be missed or misunderstood, and how systems designed to protect can sometimes fall short. Not out of negligence but out of the inherent difficulty of anticipating behavior that exists outside the expected patterns, and acknowledging that difficulty does not excuse the outcome, but it does provide a more nuanced framework for understanding how such events can occur. And within that framework there is space for both accountability and growth, for recognizing the failures that contributed to the case while also considering how those failures have informed changes in practice, in awareness, in the way similar situations might be approached in the future. And yet even with those changes, there remains an element of unpredictability that cannot be entirely eliminated, a reminder that human behavior does not always conform to systems or expectations, and that reality is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of engaging with this story. Because it resists the comfort of definitive answers, it does not allow for a sense of complete control or prevention, and instead it asks for a different kind of response, one rooted in attentiveness, in empathy, in a willingness to remain engaged with difficult truths without becoming overwhelmed by them, and as this final reflection unfolds, it becomes clear that the story does not end in a traditional sense. It does not conclude with a resolution that neatly ties together every thread. Instead it settles into something ongoing, a presence that continues to inform, to challenge, to remind, and in that sense, its true ending is not a point in time but a continuation, carried forward in memory, in conversation. In the quiet ways it shapes how people see the world and their place within it, and perhaps that is the most honest way to approach it, not as a story that can be closed but as one that remains open, not in the sense of uncertainty about what happened but in the sense of its lasting impact. Its ability to resonate beyond the boundaries of its own timeline, and in acknowledging that, there is a form of respect. A recognition that some stories are not meant to be resolved but to be remembered with a depth and seriousness that honors both the reality of what occurred and the lives that were forever changed by it. Even after everything has been said, after every angle has been explored and every timeline reconstructed, there remains a final, quiet space where this story settles, not as something that demands attention but as something that simply exists, persistent and unyielding. Woven into the broader fabric of memory in a way that cannot be undone, and it is in this space that the last reflections begin to take shape. Not driven by urgency or shock but by a need to understand how something so deeply disturbing can continue to resonate long after the events themselves have passed, because the story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka is not confined to the years in which it unfolded, it extends beyond them. Influencing how people think about trust, about relationships, about the unseen layers that exist within even the most familiar environments, and in considering that influence, there is a recognition that the impact of such a case is not linear. It does not move from beginning to end in a straightforward way, instead it radiates outward, touching different aspects of society at different times, sometimes fading into the background, sometimes resurfacing with renewed intensity when new perspectives or discussions bring it back into focus. And within this ongoing presence, there is also a shift in how the story is held, a gradual movement away from the immediate details of what happened toward a more reflective engagement with what it means, how it fits into a larger understanding of human behavior and societal response. And this shift does not diminish the reality of the events, it does not soften their severity, but it does create space for a different kind of processing, one that is less about recounting and more about integrating. About finding a way to hold the knowledge of what occurred without allowing it to eclipse everything else, and this process of integration is deeply personal, it varies from one individual to another, shaped by experience, by proximity to the events, by the ways in which each person encounters the story and chooses to engage with it, and for some, that engagement may remain analytical, focused on the procedural aspects, the investigation, the legal outcomes, the systemic implications, while for others it may be more emotional. Centered on the human cost, the lives that were lost, the families that continue to live with that loss, and both of these approaches are valid, both contribute to a more complete understanding of the case, and yet neither can fully encompass it. Because there is always something that remains beyond articulation, something that resists being fully captured in words or frameworks, and perhaps that is where the final layer of this story resides, in that space between what can be understood and what cannot. In the acknowledgement that some aspects of human behavior, some combinations of choices and circumstances, defy complete explanation, and that acknowledging this limitation is not a failure but a form of honesty, a recognition that understanding does not always equate to resolution. And as this realization settles, it brings with it a certain quietness, a shift away from the need to find definitive answers toward an acceptance of complexity, and within that acceptance there is room for a different kind of focus, one that returns, once again, to those at the center of the story. To Leslie Mahaffey, to Kristen French, to Tammy Homolka, not as figures within a case but as individuals whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances that ultimately defined how they are remembered, and in bringing that focus forward, there is an effort to rebalance the narrative. To ensure that it does not remain centered solely on those who caused harm but also honors those who were affected by it, and this rebalancing is not something that can be completed once and for all, it is an ongoing process, one that requires attention each time the story is revisited. Each time it is told or heard, and as this final part draws to a close, there is no attempt to offer a sense of closure that the story itself does not provide, no suggestion that everything has been resolved or that the impact has been fully accounted for. Instead, there is simply an acknowledgement of what remains, the memory, the questions, the lessons, the quiet awareness that continues to exist beneath the surface of everyday life, and in that acknowledgement there is a form of respect. A way of holding the story that recognizes both its weight and its complexity, and allows it to remain present without demanding that it be simplified or resolved, because some stories are not meant to be concluded in the traditional sense, they are meant to be carried, remembered, and approached with a depth of understanding that evolves over time, and in doing so, they continue to shape the way we see the world, not through fear alone but through a more nuanced awareness of the realities that exist within it, and perhaps that is the closest this story comes to an ending. Not a final point but a continuation, a quiet, enduring presence that remains long after the last words have been spoken. At a certain point, long after the details have been told and retold, after the structure of the story has settled into something familiar, there comes a quieter realization, one that does not announce itself but gradually takes shape in the way the narrative is held, in the space it occupies within memory, and that realization is that stories like this are never truly about endings, they are about continuity, about the ways in which events echo forward, influencing thoughts, decisions, and perceptions in ways that are often subtle but deeply ingrained. And in that sense the story of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka becomes less a closed chapter and more an ongoing presence, something that exists alongside other experiences, shaping how people interpret the world even when they are not consciously aware of its influence. And this influence can be seen in the questions that linger, the ones that do not have clear or comfortable answers, questions about how such a convergence of actions and circumstances can occur, about where responsibility begins and ends, about how systems designed to prevent harm can sometimes fail despite the efforts of those within them, and these questions do not resolve neatly, they remain open, inviting continued reflection rather than definitive conclusions, and within that openness there is a kind of space. A place where understanding can evolve over time, where new perspectives can be introduced, where the story can be revisited not to change its facts but to deepen its meaning, and this process of revisiting is part of what keeps the narrative alive. Part of what prevents it from becoming static or distant, because each return to the story brings with it a different context, a different set of experiences that shape how it is perceived, and in that sense the story is not only about what happened but about how it is remembered. How it is integrated into a broader awareness that extends beyond the specifics of the case, and yet even as this broader awareness develops, there remains a need to anchor the narrative in the individuals whose lives were most directly affected, to ensure that the story does not drift too far into abstraction, and that is why the names Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homolka continue to hold such importance, because they serve as a reminder that beneath every layer of analysis, every discussion of systems or patterns, there are real human lives at the center, lives that were interrupted in ways that cannot be undone, and acknowledging that reality is essential to maintaining the integrity of the story, to ensuring that it is approached with the respect and seriousness it deserves. And as this final reflection unfolds, there is a sense that the narrative has reached a point where it no longer seeks resolution in the traditional sense, it does not aim to provide closure or to tie together every thread, instead it rests in a state of ongoing engagement. A recognition that some stories remain open not because they are incomplete but because their impact extends beyond the boundaries of their own timeline, and in accepting that, there is a shift in how the story is held, from something that demands answers to something that invites contemplation. From something that shocks to something that resonates, and this resonance is perhaps the most enduring aspect of all, the way the story continues to echo in quiet ways, influencing thought, shaping awareness. Reminding those who encounter it that the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary is not always as clear as it seems, and that within that uncertainty there is both vulnerability and the potential for greater understanding, and as the narrative settles into this final space, there is no definitive end point, only a continuation, a quiet persistence that carries forward into the future, held in memory, revisited in reflection, and approached with a depth of awareness that grows over time, ensuring that while the events themselves remain in the past, their meaning continues to evolve in the present. And even here, at what feels like the furthest edge of the story, there is still something left to confront, not another fact or revelation, but a feeling, a quiet, persistent awareness that lingers beneath everything that has been said, because stories like this do not simply occupy the mind. They settle somewhere deeper, shaping the way certain moments are experienced, the way certain silences are interpreted, and it is in that subtle shift that their true endurance can be found, long after the names Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka have been spoken for the last time in this telling. Long after the details have been absorbed and set aside, there remains a kind of imprint, something that does not demand attention but is always present, influencing perspective in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, and perhaps that is the most honest place to leave a story like this. Not with a sense of finality but with an acknowledgement of that imprint, of the way it continues to exist beyond the boundaries of narrative, beyond the structure of beginning, middle, and end, because the truth is that there is no clean separation between the story and the world it inhabits. They are intertwined, each shaping the other in ways that are both visible and unseen, and in recognizing that, there is a shift away from the need to define or conclude, toward a quieter acceptance of complexity. Of the fact that some stories resist resolution not because they are incomplete but because their impact extends too far to be contained within a single framework, and within that acceptance there is also a responsibility. A recognition that engaging with such a story requires a certain level of care, not only in how it is told but in how it is held afterward, in the way it informs thought and conversation without becoming a source of distortion or fear. And this responsibility is not something that can be fulfilled once and forgotten, it is ongoing, part of the continued presence of the story itself, and as that presence persists, it invites a kind of reflection that goes beyond analysis, beyond the examination of events and motives, into a more personal space, where each individual must decide how to integrate what they have heard, what it means for their understanding of the world, how it shapes their sense of trust, of awareness, of connection, and these decisions are not uniform, they vary, shaped by experience, by perspective, by the context in which the story is encountered, and that variation is part of what keeps the narrative alive, part of what allows it to continue evolving even when the facts remain unchanged, and in that ongoing evolution, there is both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge of engaging with something that is inherently difficult without turning away, and the opportunity to develop a deeper, more nuanced awareness of the complexities that define human behavior and the systems that respond to it, and as this final reflection settles, there is a sense that the story has reached a point where it no longer seeks to explain or to resolve, it simply exists, carrying with it the weight of what has happened and the echoes of what it continues to mean, and in that existence there is a kind of quiet continuity. A reminder that some stories do not end, they persist, not as unresolved questions but as enduring presences, shaping thought, influencing perception, and remaining just beneath the surface of everyday life, where they can be returned to, reconsidered, and understood in new ways over time. And perhaps that is where this narrative ultimately rests, not in a final statement or a definitive conclusion, but in that quiet, ongoing space where memory and reflection meet, where the past continues to inform the present, and where the story, in all its complexity, remains open. Not for resolution, but for continued awareness.